I've always been a bit of a loner, even as a kid. The name's Veronica, and I've got a knack for keeping myself busy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not antisocial or anything. I just prefer my own company most of the time. My mom, bless her heart, recognized my independent streak early on. Instead of trying to change me, she channeled it into something productive. She introduced me to the world of cooking when I was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. I soaked it all up like a sponge. Mom didn't just teach me recipes, she taught me to understand food. We'd go to cafes and restaurants all over town, and she'd break down each dish for me. As I grew older, my fascination with food only intensified. I started reading articles by famous restaurant critics, realizing that food was more than just taste and texture. It was about presentation, ambience, the whole package. One day, I turned to Mom and said, "I want to write about food." She looked at me, a hint of pride in her eyes. "Then you better learn everything there is to know about it, kiddo." And that's exactly what I did. I enrolled in a culinary institute, determined to become a master of the culinary arts. After graduating, I didn't stop there. I took journalism courses, honing my writing skills. I wanted to paint pictures with words, to make people taste the food through my descriptions. My first gig as a restaurant critic was for a small local paper. I wrote about a tiny Italian place, describing the way the homemade pasta melted in my mouth and how the rich aroma of garlic and basil transported me straight to a Tuscan kitchen. To my surprise, people loved it. My editor called me the next day. "Kid, you've got a gift," he said. "Keep this up, and you'll go far." And just like that, I found my calling. I bounced from newspaper to magazine, building a reputation for honest, witty reviews. But the real game changer came when I started my own social media pages. Suddenly, I wasn't just writing for publications. I was connecting directly with food lovers all over the world. My followers grew, hanging on my every word about the latest food trends and hidden gem restaurants. It was just another Tuesday evening. I'd settled into a cozy corner table at the Rustic Spoon, a new farm-to-table joint I was reviewing. As I jotted down notes about the ambience, an elderly couple at the next table caught my eye. The woman was peering at me intently, whispering to her husband. I offered a polite smile, used to being recognized, and turned back to my notepad. "Excuse me," the woman's voice was warm, tinged with excitement. "You're Veronica Miller, aren't you? The food critic?" I nodded. "That's me. Nice to meet you." "Oh, I'm such a fan," she gushed. "I follow all your posts. Would you like to join us for dinner?" I hesitated. Normally, I preferred to dine alone when working. But something about the couple's genuine enthusiasm made me reconsider. As I settled into their table, the woman introduced herself as Martha, her husband as George. "And this is our son, Jack," she added, gesturing to a young man I hadn't noticed before. Jack looked up from his phone, his eyes meeting mine. "Hey," he said, a lopsided grin spreading across his face. "Nice to meet you." We fell into easy conversation. Martha and George were eager to hear about my recent travels, while Jack chimed in with witty comments that had me laughing despite myself. As the evening wore on, I found myself enjoying their company more than I'd expected. Jack, in particular, was easy to talk to. We discovered a shared love for obscure indie films and terrible puns. When it was time to leave, Jack hesitated. "Hey, would it be okay if I got your number? You know, in case I need restaurant recommendations or something." I felt a flutter in my stomach that had nothing to do with the meal I'd just eaten. "Sure," I heard myself say. "For restaurant recommendations." We started texting that very night. At first, it was just about food and restaurants. But soon, we were talking about everything and anything. Our chats became the highlight of my day. A month later, Jack asked me out on a proper date. I said yes without hesitation. Our first date was at a quirky little bistro I'd been meaning to try. As we sat across from each other, I realized how comfortable I felt with him. There was none of the awkwardness I'd come to expect from first dates. A year after we met, Jack proposed. It wasn't a grand, flashy affair, he knew that wasn't my style. Instead, he cooked me dinner, a valiant effort that ended with slightly charred steak and lumpy mashed potatoes, and asked me to marry him over dessert. How could I say no to that? We moved into my apartment after the wedding. We decided to be practical about our finances, creating a joint account for shared expenses. I contributed more, given my higher income, but we both felt it was fair. Living together revealed new sides of Jack. He had a habit of leaving dishes in the sink and his clothes strewn about. His toothpaste tube was perpetually uncapped, and coffee mugs multiplied on every surface. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that I wasn't perfect either. It's just an adjustment period, I told myself. We'll find our rhythm. And slowly, we did. Jack made an effort to tidy up more, and I learned to relax my standards a bit. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. 6 months later, it was time for our first vacation together. As we stood in the airport, luggage in tow, I felt a surge of excitement. I turned to Jack, ready to share my joy, when I noticed his gaze fixed on something behind me. I spun around to see Martha and George approaching us, beaming widely. They carried only small carry-on bags, looking as if they were embarking on a day trip rather than a week-long vacation. "Surprise!" Martha exclaimed, pulling Jack into a hug. "We couldn't let you two lovebirds have all the fun, could we?" I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't part of the plan. I looked at Jack, hoping for some explanation, but he avoided my gaze. "It's, kind of a family tradition," he mumbled. "We always vacation together." I forced a smile, trying to mask my disappointment and frustration. "How nice," I managed to say. "But don't you need more luggage for a week-long trip?" George waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, we'll just pick up what we need there. No point in lugging around heavy suitcases, right?" The first few days of our vacation were a whirlwind. I focused on the positives, the beautiful scenery, the interesting flavor combinations I discovered, the warm hospitality of the locals. But as the days wore on, I couldn't help but notice how freely Martha and George spent money. They shopped like there was no tomorrow, ate at the fanciest places, and never seemed to worry about the bill. One evening, as we sat in yet another overpriced restaurant, I couldn't contain my curiosity any longer. I leaned towards Jack and whispered, "How can your parents afford all this? They're retired, aren't they?" Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They're good with money," he mumbled, suddenly very interested in the menu. I wanted to press further, but Martha chose that moment to launch into a story about her bridge club, effectively ending our private conversation. As our vacation drew to a close, I found myself looking forward to returning home. The day after we returned, I decided to check our joint account, curious to see how much we'd spent. As I logged in, my eyes widened in shock. The balance was much lower than I'd expected, alarmingly so. "Jack, can you come here for a minute?" I called out, my voice tight. I turned the screen towards him. "Care to explain this?" Jack's face paled as he looked at the numbers. "I might have used our account to cover some of Mom and Dad's expenses," he admitted quietly. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger bubbling up inside me. "Jack, that was our money. Money that I mostly contributed. You should have discussed this with me first." I know, he said, reaching for my hand. "I'm sorry, Ronnie. It won't happen again, I promise." A month passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Jack kept his word and didn't touch our joint account without discussing it with me first. I tried to put the vacation incident behind us, focusing instead on my work and our life together. One crisp autumn evening, Jack came home with a spark of excitement in his eyes. "Hey, Ronnie," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood at the kitchen counter, prepping vegetables for dinner. "I've got an idea. How about we go on an overnight picnic this weekend? Just the two of us, a rented motorhome, and the great outdoors. What do you say?" The idea was appealing. We spent the next few days preparing for our mini-adventure. I packed a cooler full of gourmet sandwiches, homemade potato salad, and a bottle of wine. Jack handled the logistics, renting a compact motorhome and mapping out our route. We arrived at the campsite by mid-afternoon. The area was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and a crystal-clear lake. Jack maneuvered the motorhome into our assigned spot, and we stepped out to enjoy the fresh air. That's when I saw it. A familiar car pulling into the spot next to ours. Martha and George emerged from the car, waving enthusiastically. "Surprise!" Martha called out. "We thought we'd join you for your little getaway." I turned to Jack, hoping to see shock on his face that matched my own. Instead, he looked sheepish, avoiding my gaze. "Jack," I said, my voice low and controlled. "Did you tell them about our trip?" Before Jack could respond, Martha bustled over, pulling me into a tight hug. "Oh, isn't this exciting? A family camping trip." I forced a smile, noticing that once again, they had arrived without any supplies. No tent, no food, not even a change of clothes. As the evening wore on, it became clear that our romantic getaway had turned into a family ordeal. Martha and George dominated the conversation, regaling us with stories of their past camping adventures. They helped themselves to our food and wine, leaving little for Jack and me. When it came time to sleep, another problem arose. Our compact motorhome wasn't designed for 4 adults. And Jack turned to his mother. "You and Dad take the bedroom. Ronnie and I will manage in the car." And so, instead of enjoying a cozy night in our rented motorhome, I found myself uncomfortably curled up in the backseat of our car, with Jack snoring softly in the front. The next morning, bleary-eyed and stiff from our awkward sleeping arrangements, I suggested to Jack that we cut our trip short. The drive home was tense, filled with awkward small talk and long stretches of silence. As soon as we arrived back at our apartment, Jack's parents bid us a cheerful goodbye, seemingly oblivious to the strain their presence had caused. Once they were gone, I turned to Jack. "We need to talk about this," I said firmly. He nodded, looking resigned. "I know. I'm sorry, Ronnie. I should have told you they were coming." "It's not just about that," I sighed. "It's about boundaries, Jack. Your parents can't keep barging into our lives like this. We need to set some ground rules." Jack nodded slowly. "You're right, I'll talk to them." A couple of days after our return, I was in the kitchen testing a new recipe when the doorbell rang. To my surprise, Martha and George were standing there, bright smiles on their faces as if the vacation fiasco had never happened. "Veronica, dear," Martha exclaimed, giving me a quick hug as they bustled in. "We need your expertise. We were wondering if you could tell us which restaurants in the city have the most delicious dishes?" "Well," I said, caught off guard by the question, "there are quite a few excellent places. The French bistro downtown, Le Petit Canard, is fantastic. And Sakura Sushi on 5th Avenue has some of the best sushi I've ever tasted." "Why do you ask?" Martha's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Oh, we thought we'd keep an eye out for any open events at these restaurants. You know, so we can go and eat for free." I turned to Jack, who had just walked into the room, hoping he'd back me up. But he just shrugged and said, "Come on, Ronnie. You've got to accept my parents as they are. No use trying to change them." I was speechless. This was crossing a line, wasn't it? But before I could formulate a response, Martha and George had thanked me profusely and left, chattering excitedly about their plans to score free meals. A few days later, I was preparing for a review of a new upscale Italian restaurant, Bella Notte. As usual, I posted the details of my visit on my social media page, letting my followers know when and where they could expect my next review. The evening of the review arrived, and I settled into my table at Bella Notte, notebook in hand, ready to experience and evaluate the menu. I had just opened the wine list when I heard a familiar voice. "Well, hello there." I looked up to see Martha and George, beaming at me as they sat down at my table without invitation. My heart sank. Martha picked up a menu and announced loudly, "I'm Veronica's mother-in-law, you know." We're here to enjoy the free meal with her. I felt my face grow hot with embarrassment. Martha, I hissed, please lower your voice. I'm here to work. You can't just show up like this. But Martha wasn't listening. She raised her voice even more. Oh, don't be silly, dear. Everyone knows you food critics eat for free. Why shouldn't your family enjoy the perks too? We have every right to be here. I could feel the eyes of nearby diners on us. The head waiter was approaching our table, a concerned look on his face. This was quickly spiraling out of control. Martha, George, I said, my voice low but firm. I'm giving you one last warning. If you don't leave right now, I will have no choice but to call security. You are interfering with my work and causing a scene. Martha's face contorted with indignation. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Well, I never, she exclaimed. Is this how you treat family, Veronica? As she gathered her purse, she turned to me one last time, her voice dripping with disappointment. You know, I'm beginning to think I made a terrible mistake. I'm the one who told Jack to marry you. I followed your Facebook page, and I thought, now there's a girl who could help us enjoy the finer things in life. I thought you'd help us eat at fancy restaurants for free, maybe even support us a little. But clearly, I was wrong. If this is how you treat family, well, we're no longer interested in being part of yours. With that parting shot, Martha stormed out of the restaurant, George trailing behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands shaking, I reached for my phone and dialed Jack's number. He picked up on the third ring. Jack, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, is it true? Did your mother really push you to marry me because she thought I'd provide for them? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Jack sighed. Yes, he admitted. Mom saw your success and thought, well, you know how she is. She insisted you'd be perfect for me, for us. I felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. I hung up and turned to the head waiter, who had been hovering nearby. I'm so sorry for the disturbance, I said. I won't be able to complete my review tonight. Please extend my apologies to the chef. As I gathered my things, I pulled out my phone once more and quickly typed out an apology to my followers, explaining that due to unforeseen circumstances, my review of Bella Notte would be postponed. The drive home was a blur. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had happened. When I walked through our apartment door, Jack was waiting for me, his face etched with worry. Ronnie, he started, but I held up a hand, silencing him. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. All this time, was I just a meal ticket to your family? Jack's face crumpled. He reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. No, Ronnie, no. I mean, yes, that's how it started with my mom's idea, but I fell in love with you. The real you. Not your job or your connections, just you. I sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. He sat next to me, his eyes pleading. I know I've made mistakes. I should have set boundaries with my parents long ago. But Ronnie, I love you. I want to make this work. Can we try to fix this? I looked at him, really looked at him. Despite everything, I knew I loved him too. As we sat there on the couch, hands intertwined, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could salvage this mess and come out stronger on the other side. The next couple of months passed in relative peace. Jack made efforts to set boundaries with his parents, and I threw myself into my work, trying to rebuild the trust in our relationship. Then came the moment I'd been working towards for years. My cookbook was published. It was more successful than I could have ever imagined. Major newspapers and magazines praised it, and it quickly became a bestseller on all the major online retail sites. One evening, as I was scrolling through yet another glowing review, Jack came home with a surprise. Let's celebrate your success, he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. I've planned a trip to that charming city you've always wanted to visit. It's got everything you love, amazing restaurants, historical sites, beautiful nature, and I've booked us into that boutique hotel you've been eyeing." I hesitated for a moment, then asked the question that had been nagging at me. "It's just us, right? Your parents aren't coming?" Jack looked me in the eye. "I promise, Ronnie, it's just us. No parents, no surprises." The day of our trip arrived, and we made our way to the train station, luggage in tow. As we approached the platform, I felt my heart sink. There, waving enthusiastically, were Martha and George. I turned to Jack, hoping against hope that this was some cruel coincidence. But the guilty look on his face told me everything I needed to know. "I'm sorry," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I couldn't not invite them. Mom found out about the trip and... In that moment, something inside me broke. All the promises, all the efforts of the past months, they meant nothing. But I plastered on a smile as Martha and George approached. I noticed they only had a small purse between them. "No luggage?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Martha waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about that, dear. You'll take care of everything, won't you? After all, we're celebrating your success." As the announcement for boarding came over the loudspeaker, we made our way onto the train. As everyone settled into their seats, I stood up. "I'm just going to use the restroom before we depart," I said, grabbing my purse that contained my phone and documents. I stepped off the train, the cool air of the platform hitting my face. I stood there, watching as the train's doors closed, as the whistle blew, as it slowly began to pull away from the station. My phone buzzed in my purse, startling me out of my reverie. Jack's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. "Ronnie, where are you?" Jack's panicked voice came through. "We're no longer on the same path, Jack," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm divorcing you." I hung up, without waiting for his answer. My hand shook slightly as I opened my banking app and blocked Jack's access to our joint account. Barely a minute passed before my phone rang again. This time, it was Martha. I held the phone away from my ear as she hurled insults and threats, demanding I pay for their trip and compensate them for emotional distress. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke calmly. "Martha, I'm not afraid of your threats or your comments. If you post any slander statements, I won't hesitate to take legal action." I blocked her number, then Jack's, and finally George's, for good measure. Taking a deep breath, I called a cab and headed home. The weekend passed in a blur of emotions and practicality. I packed Jack's belongings, contacted a lawyer, and drafted divorce papers. By Monday morning, I felt exhausted but resolute. The sound of a key in the lock made me tense. Jack walked in, looking disheveled and desperate. "Ronnie, please," he began, moving towards me with open arms. I stepped back, gesturing to the suitcases by the door. "Your things are packed. It's time for you to leave." His face crumpled. "You can't mean that. Look, I've learned my lesson. I had a huge fight with my parents on the trip. I told them I wouldn't pay for them anymore. I'm not even speaking to them now. Please, give me another chance." I shook my head, handing him the divorce papers. "It's too late, Jack. This isn't just about your parents. It's about trust, respect, and the life I want to live. We want different things, and that's okay, but I can't do this anymore." After a long moment, he nodded, shoulders slumping in defeat. He picked up his suitcases and walked out, closing the door behind him with a final click. The following weeks were challenging but liberating. The divorce proceedings went smoothly, thanks to my meticulous documentation and Jack's apparent resignation. I threw myself into my work, finding solace in the kitchen and my writing. As the dust settled, I found myself alone again, but it wasn't the loneliness I had feared. I rediscovered the joy in small pleasures, experimenting with new recipes, enjoying quiet evenings with a good book, and connecting with my followers without the shadow of familial expectations. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, sipping a glass of wine and looking out over the city, I couldn't help but smile. Life hadn't turned out as I'd planned, but perhaps it had turned out exactly as it should. I was Veronica again, food critic, author, and most importantly, mistress of my own destiny.